Story 1. The patient on floor 0. When facilities opened the hidden access panel behind the painted cinderblock wall, I expected to find an abandoned corridor and a liability issue the county had buried years earlier. Instead, I found a lit nurses' station, stocked isolation carts, fresh admission packets, and a bedboard glowing blue in the dark with my name already signed in at the top. At the far end of the corridor, a patient in paper scrubs stood outside a room marked 012 and watched me without blinking. It was the same patient I had registered upstairs less than 2 hours earlier. He lifted one hand, pointed to the desk, and said, in the calm voice people use when they are tired of being doubted, that this was where I always worked after 1 in the morning. I worked psychiatric intake at a county behavioral hospital in Cleveland, Ohio. Winter of 2025 had been one of those long industrial winters the city knows too well. All hard wind off the lake, gray slush in the ambulance bay, and sidewalks that stayed glazed even after salt trucks passed. My shift ran from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning. Intake sat off the secured south entrance, behind reinforced glass and a sliding pass window, with a direct sightline to the elevator bank and the holding corridor. Most of my job involved paperwork people outside the field never thought about. I verified involuntary hold documents, confirmed medical clearance from emergency departments, entered allergies, reconciled medication lists, printed wristbands, updated bed availability, and coordinated transfers to whichever unit had a safe placement. If a patient came in confused, combative, sedated, or terrified, the paperwork still had to be right. Psychiatric hospitals lived and died by bed management. One wrong room assignment could mix incompatible patients, overload a unit, or violate observation status. I tracked every open bed in the building. Second floor housed acute adult stabilization. Third floor handled lower acuity, step-down, and older adult cases. Fourth floor was our most secure unit. The basement held maintenance, dietary storage, old records, and a tunnel connection to the general hospital across the lot. The public lobby counted as first floor. That was the whole building as far as operations went. Basement first, second, third, fourth. No one ever referenced any level in between. The patient who changed that for me arrived a little after 9 at night in the back of a city police cruiser. His name was Lionel Voss. He was 43, medically cleared, soaked from the knees down, and on an emergency hold after walking into traffic and telling drivers he was trying to stay ahead of the transport team. I had seen stranger presentations. He was not intoxicated. He was oriented to person, place, and year. His speech was coherent. He answered most of intake nurse Paula Green's questions without resistance. The first odd thing he said came when Paula asked if he had been admitted to our facility before. He looked past both of us toward the secured elevator and said, very quietly, that he had been kept on floor 0 before they moved him upstairs. Paula glanced at me. I gave the small shrug intake staff use when a symptom presents early. Delusional content was not unusual on arrival. I asked him whether he meant a basement holding room. He shook his head. He said the basement was for pipes and laundry. Floor 0 was for people whose paperwork was not ready to exist yet. That was the kind of sentence you wrote down without reacting to. I began his registration, verified the legal hold, and printed his wristband. While I entered his pharmacy history, he watched the bedboard over my shoulder with a focus that made me uncomfortable. Then he asked me not to send him back to room 012. He said there was no window in that room, but snow still came through the wall. I told him we did not have a room by that number. He nodded the way patients sometimes nodded when they had heard a lie repeated too often to bother challenging it. Then he said I had told him this thing the last time. At that point, I assumed he was blending institutions or projecting structure onto a psychotic theme. I opened live bed management to assign him upstairs. Fourth floor had been my best option on paper, but when the board refreshed, a single additional line appeared below the listed units. It showed one clean bed available in a location marked 0-12. Unit description: floor 0 intake overflow. I stared at it long enough for Paula to ask whether the system had frozen. I clicked into the listing. The entry was fully formed. It had bed status, a staffing flag, and a transfer origin field left blank. Then, before I could print the placement slip, the line disappeared. I called bed management. Renata Cole, the overnight supervisor, told me the software had a habit of surfacing retired locations after updates, and that I should ignore what she called ghost beds. Her tone was dismissive but not unusual. Hospital systems were patched together from old programs all the time. I refreshed the board again. The listing was gone. Lionel ended up waiting in intake while fourth floor turned over a discharge room. If it had stopped there, I would have forgotten it before the shift ended. It did not stop there. Around 10:30, I opened Lionel's prior encounter history to copy medication data from an admission the year before. The encounter summary showed a normal emergency arrival, but the internal transfer history listed 2 locations I had never seen before. Intake hold to 0 intake corridor, 0 intake corridor to 0-12, 0-12 to 4th floor. The timestamps were real. Each movement carried a staff verification field. I opened the details expecting corrupted metadata and found discrete room assignments, completed transfer steps, and an audit trail clean enough to pass review. I printed the page and brought it upstairs to Renata. She barely looked at it. She said old locations survived software conversions. I asked why a retired location would carry bed-level detail and transfer logic. She told me bed management was not the place to solve legacy architecture questions at 11 at night. Then she looked at me with that careful, neutral expression behavioral staff learn early, the one that says you may be escalating something unnecessary. That bothered me more than the record. Back in intake, Lionel remained awake in the holding room. I brought him water after midnight. He thanked me and asked whether the elevators still stopped too long between basement and 1. I said there was no floor between basement and 1. He told me to look at the call buttons when I had a minute. I did. The south elevator still had old square metal buttons instead of a touch panel. Basement sat at the bottom, then a blank metal plate, then 1, 2, 3, and 4. I had ridden that elevator for years. I had never paid attention to the blank plate. Once Lionel mentioned it, I noticed the scratches around it. The metal there was worn more heavily than around 3 and 4. The rest of the night developed a strange static around it. A dietary tray ticket printed with a routing note that said "Do not send below." A transport request fired from a location field with no active unit attached at 3 in the morning. The wristband printer spit out a label on its own. It had no patient name, no date of birth, and no medical record number. It only listed a destination, 0 intake corridor. I kept the label. By morning, I had convinced myself several connected systems were pulling from dead data. That explanation held until my next shift, when 4th floor staff told me Lionel continued asking why I denied remembering him. He had begun telling anyone who would listen that I used to process transfers downstairs before the county painted the walls. I had never worked anywhere except the intake desk off the south entrance. On my meal break that night, I went to facilities. The supervisor, Owen Mercer, had been in the building long enough to remember 3 administrators, 2 renovations, and every major pipe break. I asked if the hospital had ever used a sub-level admission area. He took his time answering. Then he said the older wing once had a below-grade observation corridor cut into the hill behind the ambulance ramp. It handled overflow admissions, emergency seclusion, and court transport holds in the 1980s and 90s. After water intrusion, mold issues, and later legal review, it had been closed. I asked what it had been called. He said some people called it lower intake. I asked if anyone called it floor 0. He did not answer directly. He only said hospitals stopped naming rooms long before those rooms stopped affecting operations. That answer stayed with me. So did the phrase legal review. Later that same night, I checked Lionel's chart again. A new nursing note described him, insisting that intake staff had already processed him below the lobby. The entry had been made under my credentials. I knew I had not written it. I opened the audit trail expecting to find somebody had borrowed a workstation without logging out. Instead, I found a location tag attached to the note. Workstation FZ intake 1. I printed that page too. By then, I had stopped trying to prove a harmless glitch. What I wanted was a chain of custody for the lie. Our hospital was old, underfunded, and politically managed. Hidden architecture I could believe. Buried liability I could believe even more. What I could not tolerate was the feeling that the institution around me already knew something I was still being trained not to see. Snow started again just after midnight on my fourth shift after Lionel's admission. Intake quieted. Police traffic slowed. The building took on that sealed, insulated atmosphere hospitals get during bad weather, as if the world outside had become theoretical. I kept hearing the south elevator chime without doors opening. At 1:15, the bedboard flashed a transfer line from 0 intake corridor to second floor. No patient name showed. The line vanished before I could click it. I called security. The camera desk officer said no patient movement had been logged, but one of the lower-level feeds had fuzzed out for several seconds and come back on its own. When the desk was clear, I told Paula I was checking basement supply stock and took the service stairs down. The basement looked exactly like it always did. Concrete floor, pipe noise, old records cages, maintenance carts. But near the south ramp wall, there was a painted cinder block partition I had somehow never examined closely. It sealed off what was plainly an older corridor. Beside it sat an elevator call plate with the buttons removed. Above it, under paint, was a stenciled 0. I stood there long enough to hear a gurney wheel turn behind the wall. Not a pipe knock, not building noise. A caster with a bad bearing, rotating slowly under weight. Then came 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I went back upstairs so fast I nearly ran into Security Officer Dale Kern in the stairwell. He asked if I was all right. I heard myself say yes. My monitor was unlocked when I returned to intake. The transfer queue was open. Lionel Voss had been discharged from 4th floor at 1:27 and transferred to 0 intake corridor. I called 4th floor at once. The nurse there told me Lionel was asleep. I watched the transfer status icon on my screen change from pending to complete. Then the nurse came back to the line and said his room was empty. Security pulled the footage. Lionel left his room calmly at 1:19, walked to the staff elevator, and stepped inside alone. No alarm sounded. The elevator did not register at 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or basement. The internal log, which Owen later showed me in person, displayed a stop at 0. There was no 0 on the service contract. No overhead alert went out. That part still bothers me. A secure patient vanished, and the institution reacted the way institutions always react when a problem threatens structure rather than safety. Quietly. Staff were told not to agitate the units. Patients were kept in place. Search patterns stayed contained. Renata stopped answering direct questions. At 3 in the morning, Owen finally called and told me to meet him in the basement. He arrived carrying an old key ring and a flashlight. He said there had been prior scrutiny years earlier about undocumented holds during bed shortages, and that county council had recommended the lower corridor remain inaccessible and undescribed in public materials. He spoke in cautious fragments, like a man reciting something already approved. Then he moved stacked supply bins aside and unlocked a narrow steel panel hidden in the painted wall. The passage beyond sloped downward. It smelled of bleach, wet plaster, and stale air trapped 2 long motion lights woke in sequence as we walked. The corridor opened into a functioning intake station. Not an abandoned shell, a functioning station. Fresh gloves, current admission packets, medication carts, room placards, contemporary wristband wrappers in a trash bin. The bedboard at the central desk ran the same program I used upstairs. My login initials glowed in the corner. Beyond the station, room doors lined both sides of the hall. One plaque read 0-12. Lionel stood beside it in hospital scrubs, not restrained, not confused, just watching me with exhausted recognition. He said softly that I had finally come back down. I turned to Owen and told him someone was using my credentials. He did not answer. He was staring at a framed evacuation map on the wall. It was an older county floor plan, yellowed at the edges: south intake, transport lock, observation corridor, clerk station. Typed beneath the clerk station in neat block letters was my full name. There was also a badge photograph. It was me, younger by several years. Maybe, but unmistakably me. Same face, same last name, same county badge number. I told Owen I had only been hired 5 years earlier. He asked me when I thought the renovation had happened. I said 3 or 4 years ago. He said 17. What followed never became a report anyone admitted to. Lionel was gone when security finally came below. They searched the corridor and found only an empty room, a dent in the mattress, and a transfer slip already printed for a unit upstairs. My badge audit showed repeated access events at floor 0 across the previous 11 months, usually between 1 and 3 in the morning. I had no memory of making any of them. Occupational health suggested sleep deprivation, stress, dissociation, and the known cognitive strain of permanent overnights. County administration called the hidden corridor a retired service zone with residual data. Contamination. Facilities sealed the access again before day shift arrived. I resigned 2 months later. That would sound like an ending if the smaller things had stopped. They did not. Blank wristband labels still appeared in my mailbox for weeks after I left. Once during a snowstorm, I found a transfer sheet folded under my apartment door. No patient name, no sending unit. Just a bed assignment to 0-12 and my initials at the bottom where intake authorization should have been. I work at another hospital now, farther from Cleveland and newer by decades. The software is cleaner. The elevators speak the floor numbers out loud, but on winter nights, when a frightened patient tells me they have already been kept somewhere the building does not list, I no longer correct them as quickly as I used to. Hospitals are full of spaces removed from maps but never from routine, and once a place learns how to hold people outside the record, it does not forget just because the county paints over the door. Story 2. The woman in group therapy. By Sunday afternoon, the entire process group had gone silent because the empty chair beside the window was occupied again. No one said that at first. They just kept looking at the same point in space and waiting with the polite, strained patience people use when someone else is already speaking. I asked who they were looking at, and 3 patients answered at once with the same name. Then the charge nurse standing behind me quietly leaned down and asked whether I wanted her to bring in the extra workbook for that woman too. What frightened me was not that the patients agreed. It was that the nurse sounded embarrassed for having almost forgotten her. Later, when I played back the session recording, I heard my own voice ask a question I never remembered asking, followed by a second female voice giving my exact answer a moment before I did. In the spring of 2026, I was a psychiatric social worker at a long-term behavioral rehabilitation center outside Eugene, Oregon. We served adults moving out of acute hospitalization, but not yet ready for independent discharge. Some were court-involved. Some had chronic psychotic disorders complicated by homelessness, traumatic brain injury, or severe mood instability. Some simply had no safe place to go once an inpatient unit considered them technically stabilized. The center itself was low, modern, and deceptively calm from the outside. Cedar siding, fenced courtyards, rain gutters that never stopped dripping in March and April inside. The work was procedural, repetitive, and often quietly exhausting. Most of my hours went to discharge planning, family contact, benefits applications, housing coordination, transport forms, and group facilitation. Weekend doubles were the hardest. On Saturdays and Sundays, the administrative structure thinned out. Therapists were gone. Most case management staff were off. Nursing remained. Mental health associates remained. And one social worker floated between units, keeping required groups on schedule and handling anything that might affect discharge timelines on Monday. That spring, I had accepted back-to-back double shifts because another social worker went out on medical leave. For 2 weekends in a row, I opened the building at dawn and left after dark. The group where the problem started was called Transition Readiness. It was a recurring small group for residents within 30 days of tentative discharge. We covered medication adherence, transportation planning, warning signs of decompensation, boundary setting, and the practical dread that often came with leaving structured care. The members rotated, but not entirely. Over several weeks, you saw the same faces long enough to notice who sat near the door, who copied everyone else's answers, who pretended to joke whenever fear got too close to the surface. I facilitated from a printed workbook and took attendance by census number because insurance audits cared about numbers more than names. The first mention of the woman came from a resident named Lyle Benton. He was 50, meticulous, and usually more grounded than most of the group. During a discussion about relapse triggers, he said he disagreed with what the woman by the window had said the previous week about how discharge was just another type of transfer. I assumed he meant another resident from a different session. I asked for the name. He said, without hesitation, June Weller. No one on the current roster had that name. No one on the recent rosters did either. I let it pass because group memory was loose and people frequently carried conversations from one setting into another. But 10 minutes later, another resident, Nina Croft, told Lyle he was misquoting June, and that June had actually said discharge only felt like freedom if somebody else had already decided where you were allowed to end up. Nina spoke with the irritated familiarity of someone correcting a real person, not referencing a hallucinated figure. Then a third resident rolled his eyes and said June only ever talked when the worksheets got too close to home. I checked the sign-in sheet after group, 8 names, 8 initials, no June Weller. The following Saturday, the same name came up before I had even started. One resident asked if June had been moved to another unit. Another said she had promised to bring in a letter from her brother. A third complained that June always chose the chair by the window because she liked to see the staff parking lot. The details were petty, social, and consistent in a way purely symptomatic material rarely was. Delusional content often had intensity, but it usually lacked the friction of ordinary interpersonal memory. These residents did not describe June as a grand conspiracy or spiritual entity. They described her as annoying in small, familiar ways. After that session, I pulled charts, daily census sheets, and archived group sign-ins for the previous month. There was no patient by that name. No alias close to it, no recent discharge that fit. I checked temporary holds, outside passes, and transfers from the adjoining step-down cottage. Nothing. The unit clerk told me maybe the residents had combined 2 people into one. That can happen in long-term care. Group memory becomes communal, and the need for a stable social narrative sometimes smooths over facts. I accepted that explanation until the charge nurse, Beth Loomis, stopped me in the med room and asked if I had heard whether June was refusing family calls again. I asked what June she meant. Beth stared at me for a second, then her expression changed in a way I still have trouble describing. It was not confusion exactly. It was the face people make when a word they have used casually for weeks suddenly loses shape in the mouth, she said. More slowly, the woman from my weekend group, tall brown sweater, always sat by the window. Then she frowned and admitted she could not place a room number. That was the first time staff memory entered it. I started documenting references in my notebook, not in the medical record: date, time, speaker, content. I did it because I wanted to see whether the descriptions drifted. They did not. Over the next week, I collected the same cluster of details from 6 residents and 3 staff members. Female, approximately late 40s. Quiet at first, sat near the window, spoke most often during discharge planning, had strong opinions about transportation and release paperwork, argued with Lyle Benton, once borrowed a pen from me and never returned it. That last detail came from my own mouth. I said it before I had consciously decided I remembered her. Beth had been listing reasons. The whole thing was probably just social contamination. When I interrupted and said I thought June had used one of my black click pens during workbook review, the sentence arrived complete, effortless, and entirely uninvited. I even remembered for a brief, vivid second, watching her tuck the pen into the coil of her workbook while apologizing that she always lost things right before discharge. The memory felt real. It also had nowhere to come from. After that, I began checking the group room itself. It was an ordinary therapy room on the west side of the building. Whiteboard, locked cabinet, box of dull pencils, 2 narrow windows facing a parking lot and stand of wet fir trees, 9 chairs. I had always set out 8 because that matched the group census. The Monday after Beth and I spoke, I walked in and found 9 workbooks on the table. The extra one had no label, but several pages had been dog-eared in the middle. I asked the evening staff if they had prepared the room. No one had. I reviewed camera footage from the hallway because the group room did not record audio or video inside for confidentiality reasons. The camera only showed residents entering and leaving. Each session began the same way. 8 people entered, 8 people left. What bothered me was the choreography. On 2 separate weekends, every resident approaching the room paused at the threshold, stepped slightly aside, as though allowing someone already beside them to go in first. I took that footage to our program director on Monday morning. She watched it twice and told me gently that exhaustion could do strange things to pattern recognition. She advised sleep, hydration, and left our private theorizing with residents. She was not cruel. She was doing what supervisors do in psychiatric settings when a staff member starts taking ambiguous material too personally. She reminded me that patients in long-term rehab often built shared social fictions to tolerate uncertainty. She said if the missing participant had no chart and no body, then there was no participant. That would have settled me if staff memory had not continued spreading. By the next weekend, one mental health associate remembered escorting June to the vending machines. Another remembered redirecting her after she cried during visiting hours. Beth remembered with growing confidence that June disliked apple juice and complained about the scent of the lavender hand soap. These were not dramatic recollections. They were exactly the kind of thin, disposable details real patients left in your mind after weeks of contact. Then I found one of my own progress notes from the previous month. It was a standard group entry. 8 residents attended, skills covered, participation level, affect, insight. Yet halfway through the note I had written, June challenged the assumption that discharge equals autonomy. I had capitalized the name as if it belonged to someone unquestionably present. There was no matching patient identifier anywhere in the charting system. I checked the note metadata. It was mine. Written on a Sunday at 4 in the afternoon. During a group I clearly remembered facilitating, I did not remember writing that sentence. By then my notebook had become less of an investigation and more of a quarantine line. I wrote down every reference before it blurred with my own recall, but the more I wrote, the more details arrived. June sat with her left ankle tucked behind the chair leg. June asked if I had ever been discharged from anything I agreed to. June laughed once, during a discussion about bus schedules, and said, "Institutions love teaching people how to leave, as long as leaving happened in a way the institution could still narrate." That sentence lodged in me because it sounded like something I would have remembered admiring. On the second Sunday of the double shift, I decided to test the group. Before anyone entered, I removed one chair and set out only 8 workbooks. When the residents came in, they hesitated. Lyle Benton stopped near the window and said someone was missing a seat. I asked who. He looked at me as if I were creating unnecessary tension and said June, obviously. Nina Croft asked whether June had been transferred without saying goodbye. Another resident turned to the empty space and muttered that June hated when people made a thing out of her being late. Then Beth, standing by the door with the attendant's clipboard, quietly picked up a spare chair from the hall and placed it back in the circle without being asked. No one thanked her. Everyone seemed relieved. I ran the session anyway. I kept my voice steady, moved page by page through the workbook, and tried not to let my attention snag on the vacant chair. It was impossible. The patients kept orienting toward it. They laughed after pauses that were slightly too long. Twice I caught myself leaving room in the discussion for another answer. About halfway through, Lyle interrupted me and said June had already asked the question I was repeating. I asked what question, he said. Do staff remember us differently after we leave? Or do they need us to have always been the kind of people who were about to leave? I had no memory of asking that, but when I checked the digital recorder we used for supervision review, I heard the session begin with my voice welcoming the group. Then 6 minutes in, a second female voice asked that exact question in a lower, rougher register before I spoke again. It was not any resident in the room. Beth listened to the clip twice and told me it sounded like me after I had lost my voice during flu season. That night I went through archived paper materials in the social work office. Older centers kept strange records in strange places, and our building had absorbed 2 prior programs before becoming a rehabilitation facility. I found handouts, discharge binders, and group attendance packets going back years. June Weller did not appear as a registered patient, but in margins, yellow sticky notes, and supervision summaries, I kept finding references to a woman in group who prompted other residents to speak frankly about discharge fears. No room number, no legal name confirmed, just the woman near the window. The woman who remembered previous groups. The woman who said staff transition faster than patients. The oldest note I found was 8 years old. It said almost offhandedly that several residents had once mistaken the facilitator for the woman by the window after a difficult Sunday session. I sat with that page for a long time. On Monday morning, I called the prior clinical director, who had retired to the coast. She remembered the phenomenon before I finished describing it. She did not sound surprised. She sounded tired. She said every few years a group developed a shared participant who became more vivid the closer members got to discharge. Sometimes the image faded when the census changed. Sometimes staff started remembering her too. She told me the safest practice had always been not to chase it, because investigation seemed to strengthen coherence. Then she said something I have replayed many times since. She said the woman was never exactly a ghost and never exactly imaginary. She was what happened when too many people needed one person in the room to say the part no one wanted recorded. I asked if she had ever seen the woman herself. There was a long pause. Then she said she had once mistaken a window reflection for someone turning a workbook page. My second Sunday session after that call was the one in the hook. I entered late because a family discharge dispute ran over. When I stepped into the group room, everyone was already seated. 9 chairs, 9 workbooks. The empty chair by the window had a workbook open to the relapse planning page. Lyle looked up and asked whether June had spoken to me in the hall. Before I answered, Beth leaned in from the doorway and asked if I wanted the extra workbook for June too. I said there was no June. My voice came out flat, almost procedural. No one argued. They just looked at me with the same strained patience you use when a staff member is having a hard day. Then Nina said carefully that June had been there a minute ago and that I had been answering her, and that maybe I should sit down because I looked pale. I checked the recorder afterward. The entire first part of the session had been captured. I could hear chairs move, pages turn, my own opening remarks, and then another female voice carrying on a calm discussion with me about whether discharge plans were just a softer version of transfer orders. I recognized the phrasing. I recognized the cadence. What I could not recognize was whether the second voice belonged to a stranger or to some version of myself I had been hearing through other people. All month, I transferred to a different service line before summer. Officially, I cited burnout and schedule strain. Unofficially, I needed work where attendance could still be counted without argument. Even now, years later, I can be halfway through a case conference and feel a pause develop at the edge of the room, as if someone has just settled into a chair no one set out. Group work taught me that memory is social long before it is factual. In that building, during those weekends, something learned how to enter the space between those two conditions and stay there. I still do not know whether June Weller was a person we forgot, a fiction we built together, or a place in the conversation that finally grew strong enough to speak back. Story 3. Quiet hours begin. The second time the overhead announcement told us quiet hours were beginning, the patient in room 7 did not even look up from his blanket. He only held out his medication cup toward me and said I had already forgotten this part once. My scanner showed the dose as due in 3 minutes. The wall clock over the nurse's station said it had been administered 11 minutes earlier. Security called at that exact moment to ask whether we had meant to log the same hallway check twice under 2 different times, because the footage showed me walking past room 7 in the same direction on both clips. Then the intercom crackled again with the same soft female voice, the same static pop at the beginning, and the same sentence about lights being dimmed for the evening. I knew the words before she said them because I had just heard them. The patient looked at me with exhausted pity and asked whether I finally believed him. I was a night nurse on a secure adult ward at the Montana State Mental Health Facility outside Missoula. Graveyard shift started at 10 at night, immediately after final snack, and ended at 6:30 in the morning with report to day staff. The building sat back from the road with pines on one side and a wind-cut field on the other. In autumn, the cold came down early from the mountains, and the windows along the East Hall clicked all night from pressure changes. Our ward held a mix of civil commitment patients, forensic step-downs, and chronic psych cases requiring close medication monitoring. Nights were structured by repetition, safety rounds every 15 minutes, as-needed medication checks, midnight vitals on selected patients, quiet hours enforcement, chart reconciliation before dawn. On a functional unit, routine was not background. Routine was the treatment frame. I liked nights because routine made honest nurses out of everyone. Day shift could hide confusion in meetings and movement. At night, there were fewer witnesses and fewer excuses. You either gave the medication, documented it correctly, and kept the unit safe, or you did not. I had been on that ward almost 6 years. I knew which door latches stuck in dry weather, which patient would ask for decaf at midnight, despite having refused it at 8, and how long it took the intercom to chirp before the automated voice gave standard announcements. Quiet hours always began at 10:30. Fire drill tests, when they happened, were always announced from the administrative wing before 10. Security badge sync usually lagged by no more than a minute. The patient who first drew my attention to timing was Wesley Trent in room 7. He was admitted for a schizoaffective presentation with significant paranoia, insomnia, and fixed beliefs about institutional systems. He spent most evenings wrapped in his blanket on top of the bed, listening to the sounds of the ward with the concentration of a hunter. He did not cause problems, he simply observed. On my 3rd week covering that hall for the fall rotation, he told me the intercom was about to tell us quiet hours were beginning early. I checked the station clock, 10:27. I said it was still 3 minutes out. He said, no, it had already happened once. Then the speaker clicked and the recorded announcement began. I assumed he had timed it from habit. Patients learned routines quickly. But the next night he told the technician on rounds that security would call about the courtyard door before the phone rang. A minute later, security called about the courtyard door. The night after that, he told me one of the ceiling lights over the day room would flicker twice and fail. It did again. I could rationalize it. He might have noticed a pattern or overheard maintenance talk. In psychiatric care, prediction often seemed supernatural, only until you mapped what an anxious person had been studying while everyone else rushed past. Still, there was something about the way Wesley spoke that kept me from dismissing him cleanly. He never claimed special powers. He never looked pleased when he was right. He sounded irritated, the way an experienced traveler sounds when a delayed train announcement repeats information they already heard on the platform. One night during MedPass, he asked why our clocks no longer agreed with each other. I told him they did agree. He gestured toward the wall clock, the medication scanner, and the digital display above the Sally port. Wall clock said 11:12. Scanner timestamp showed 11:10. Sally port display said 11:14. Small drifts happened. After power fluctuations, one clock or another sometimes lagged until maintenance resynced it. I put in a work order. Maintenance answered the next day that all timing systems were synced to the central server and functioning within acceptable tolerance. The drifts widened anyway. Our medication administration record began stamping doses a few minutes before I recalled giving them. Security logs placed routine hall checks after charting entries that referred to those checks in past tense. A mental health technician named Brent swore he had already helped one patient change into clean scrubs, then found himself doing the same task again because the first set was inexplicably still soiled. He laughed it off as night shift brain. I tried to laugh with him. By the middle of October, Wesley had developed rules. If the intercom crackled once without a voice following, he said the next announcement would be repeated. If the medication scanner lagged for more than 2 seconds before accepting a barcode, he said we had already passed that point in the shift. If a patient woke suddenly 1 minute before a routine hall light dimmed, he said the quiet hour loop was about to start. I asked him what he meant by loop. He said nights on the ward had begun folding wrong at the middle, and the intercom was the first system dumb enough to play back what had already happened. That would have stayed in the category of patient logic if I had not started finding my own notes in the chart before I wrote them. Nothing impossible at first. A phrase here, an observation there. Patient awake at the doorway awaiting medication. Corridor pacing decreased after reassurance. Those were the sorts of lines I wrote automatically. But twice I opened a chart and found a note carrying my usual wording and my digital signature with a timestamp 5 or 6 minutes in the future. The first time I assumed a cache issue. The second time the future note described Wesley asking whether I remembered doing this already. He asked that question 9 minutes later. I took screenshots and went to the overnight house supervisor. She reviewed them, checked the server incident board, and told me our electronic record had experienced occasional latency after the last update. When I mentioned clock drift and duplicated security moments, her expression cooled almost imperceptibly. Psychiatric nurses learned early not to over-identify with patient frameworks. We were expected to observe delusion, not collaborate with it. I knew that. I also knew the house supervisor stopped wearing her analog watch the following week. The ward itself changed in ways that were harder to document but easier to feel. Quiet hours had always been the gentlest part of the night. Lights dimmed, televisions cut off, footsteps softened. The building settled. Now that stretch of time felt padded, as if the hours between 10:30 and 2 in the morning had more fabric in them than they should. Sounds arrived half familiar. The ice machine in the nourishment room sometimes dumped a tray of cubes twice in the same pattern. The east hall door would drift shut, latch, and then seem to repeat the last inch of movement a second later. Once during rounds I passed room 9 and heard a patient snoring behind the door. 20 seconds later at the nurse's station, I heard the same snore again through the monitor speaker with the same catch in the middle. I began writing physical notes on scrap paper in my pocket so I could compare them with the electronic record. At 11:47 on a Thursday, I wrote that patient in room 3 had requested as needed medication for anxiety. When I checked the MAR, the medication had already been scanned at 11:41 and signed off by me. The sealed cup was still in my hand. I did not tell anyone about that one. Instead, I started testing the systems. I synchronized my watch to the phone in the break room. I photographed clock faces. I asked security to mark exact call times in writing. I even checked the analog clock in the seclusion anteroom because it had never been connected to the central server. That old clock had stopped long before I worked there. It always read 1:43. One night after a repeated quiet hours announcement, I walked past it and found the second hand moving. Only for 6 ticks, then it stopped again. Wesley watched me through all of this with the patience of a man waiting for a professional to admit an obvious wound. He began predicting not just announcements, but staff movements. Brent would forget his pen at the charting station and come back for it in exactly 2 minutes. Security would call about a north fence sensor after the second round of snack requests. The charge nurse from the next ward would appear at our door, holding a missing blanket report before midnight vitals were completed. He got them right often enough that the ward techs started joking about his crystal ball. Wesley never smiled. One night he told me a patient would fall in the shower room at 12:17. I checked on the patient twice between midnight and 12:15. He was asleep both times. At 12:17 exactly, the overhead speaker announced a code gray in shower 1 on our unit. The patient had gotten out of bed, walked unsteadily to the shower, slipped, and struck the wall hard enough to split the skin above his eyebrow. The incident report later listed the first staff response at 12:16. That was the first event I could not explain away with pattern recognition. After that, my own confidence began to erode in the specific way healthcare confidence erodes, not dramatically, procedurally. I stopped trusting timestamps. Then I stopped trusting whether I had completed tasks in the order I remembered. I began double-checking locks, then double-checking the double checks. The more I verified, the less stable the sequence felt. Once I signed off on 15-minute rounds and immediately found the same sheet in the hallway clipboard with my handwriting already filling the next interval. Another time security called to ask why I had requested a camera review of the medication room before I had even decided to request it. I finally asked our IT support liaison about the central clock server. He told me the facility had replaced the timing controller after a lightning incident the previous summer. The new system pushed synchronized time to medication scanners, security stations, badge access points, and intercom scheduling. When I asked whether buffered announcements could replay accidentally, he said only if the queue received duplicate triggers. Then he frowned and added that duplicate triggers had been documented on one unit during overnight hours, but only in relation to quiet time messages. Our unit. Wesley listened while I explained part of that in simplified language during MedPass. He nodded as if I had arrived late to a meeting everyone else already understood. He said the announcements were not playing early. They were leaking through from the next pass of the night. I asked what that meant. He said quiet hours were not a time. They were a section of the ward, and we had started walking through it more than once. That sentence should have sounded nonsensical. Instead, it made a sick kind of operational sense. The repeated announcements, the duplicated checks, the future notes, the sense of the night thickening in the middle. Not a clock running wrong, a segment replaying. I stayed past shift change the next morning to compare badge access, chart entries, and security call logs over a 2-week span. The discrepancies clustered almost entirely between 10:30 and 2. Sometimes the order inverted, sometimes entries duplicated. Sometimes a call appeared twice, with times 6 or 8 minutes apart in identical wording. Security footage from the hall did something worse. On 2 separate nights, I watched myself cross the day room, disappear past the seclusion doors, and then cross the day room again from the same direction less than a minute later, carrying the same medication tray. I took copies to the nursing administrator. She told me fatigue plus pattern fixation could become self-reinforcing, especially on psychiatric units where patient content influenced staff expectation. She relieved me from the floor for 1 shift and suggested occupational health. I agreed because I wanted someone else on the unit to tell me the timing had stabilized. It did not. Brent called me at home after midnight on my relief night. He said Wesley had predicted the exact wording of a fire panel test 5 minutes before. The intercom sounded. He also said the scanner had rejected a bedtime dose because it had already been charted by me. Even though I was not in the building, I returned the next evening against advice. I told myself I needed 1 clean observation period, 1 night of direct evidence without the soft haze of accumulated fear. The air had gone sharp outside. Wind scraped branches against the high windows. At 10:30, quiet hours began on schedule. At 11:12, the speaker crackled without a message. Wesley looked at me and said we were about to do the middle again. At 11:19, the wall clock skipped backward 2 minutes. At 11:21, I heard Brent laugh in the medication room. At 11:26, I heard the same laugh again from the same place with the same clipped inhale at the end. At 11:29, the intercom announced that quiet hours were beginning. Several patients called out in irritation. I looked at the Ma'ar. Wesley's medication showed as due in 3 minutes, already administered 7 minutes ago, and overdue by 1 minute depending on which screen I opened. I brought the cup to his door anyway. He held it out toward me and asked whether I finally believed him. Security called to ask why I had logged duplicate hall checks. Then the intercom repeated the quiet hours message again. For a few seconds, the ward seemed to separate into overlapping layers. I could hear the day room television shutting off, even though it had already been off for an hour. I could hear a shower room call light that had not yet activated. I could hear my own shoes approaching the nurse's station from behind me while I was still standing in front of room 7. When I turned, no one was there. Wesley swallowed his medication and said the loop only tightened when staff tried to pin it to 1 clock. I asked him how he knew. That he said because this was not the first night he had watched me learn it. Morning came eventually, but not in a way that felt earned. Day shift walked in carrying coffee and ordinary complaints. Their clocks all agreed. The duplicated announcements had vanished from the queue history. Several of my screenshots were corrupted. The administrator told me I had likely experienced an acute stress reaction and mandated leave. Before I left the unit, I checked the seclusion anteroom clock one last time. It still read 1:43. The second hand moved once. I no longer work overnights. I tell myself that matters. Still, some mornings I wake with the distinct professional certainty that I have already given report, already driven home, already stood in my kitchen with my shoes still, on listening for an overhead voice that should not follow me there. Quiet hours were supposed to be a protocol, a controlled descent into rest. On that ward they became something else, a place in the night that could be entered, repeated, and perhaps never fully exited. Every so often, just as I am falling asleep, I hear a soft burst of static and a woman calmly informing me that lights are now being dimmed for the evening. The voice is getting closer to my own. Story 4. Room 412 never emptied. He slid the paper across the desk with the same deliberate care I had spent all night using on his chart, as if he were worried I might damage it before I understood what it meant. It was an admission note on yellowed university letterhead from the middle of the 1990s. The prose was clipped, restrained, and painfully familiar. Patient remained courteous but vertically vigilant, insight partial, effect composed, though his attention appeared fixed on the exit route throughout interview. I had used that exact phrase, vertically vigilant, in one of my notes the day before. The signature at the bottom was my own name in my own hand. The date had been written years before I finished middle school. When I looked up, the patient in room 412 was already watching my face with the weary sympathy of someone who had seen this realization happen to other people before me. I was a psychiatry resident at a university teaching hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Thanksgiving coverage was always a distortion field in academic medicine. Attendings rotated off service, consult volumes thinned in some places and spiked in others, support staff vanished, and the residents left behind carried a larger share of the hospital's uninterrupted needs. In late November of 2025, I was in my second year, old enough to be trusted alone overnight and still junior enough to accept that exhaustion, confusion, and institutional oddity were part of the training atmosphere. The psychiatric unit occupied one wing of an older tower attached to the main hospital by two enclosed bridges. Our inpatient service included mood disorders, acute psychosis, medically complicated behavioral cases, and a small locked section reserved for long-stay patients whose care had become more academic than curative. Room 412 sat at the end of that locked section. The patient there was named Eleanor Vale. She had been hospitalized on and off within the university system for decades, with periods of commitment, step-down placement, return, and administrative limbo. When the attending signed out holiday coverage to me, he described her as diagnostically overdetermined and institutionally permanent. She carried old labels that had changed names over time, but all pointed at some mixture of delusional disorder, trauma-related dissociation, and treatment-resistant paranoia. She was usually calm, articulate, and impossible to discharge because every placement eventually sent her back with the same sentence in the packet. Patient reports prior knowledge of staff and unit activity in ways that destabilize milieu. That was an odd sentence, but not the oddest chart language I had inherited. My overnight duties were straightforward. Respond to nursing concerns. Evaluate new consults from the emergency department if they could not wait until morning. Renew restraint orders if required. Review as needed medication use. Check on any high-risk patients. Update the progress notes enough that the attending could survive rounds after the holiday. What makes residency dangerous is not the complexity of any one task. It is the accumulation of small, authoritative acts performed while tired enough to misplace your own interior edges. I first met Eleanor just after 11 at night. The unit was quiet. Half the overhead lights were dimmed for holiday staffing. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured through a closed door. Eleanor sat upright in the chair by her bed, wearing a pale cardigan over standard hospital clothes, hands folded, posture almost formal. She looked older than her chart photograph, but not frail. Her room was unusually neat. No scattered papers, no hoarded cups, no improvised shrine of personal objects the way some long-stay rooms developed. The only thing out of place was the case file box on her desk, a thick archive of prior hospitalizations the day team had left for me to review. When I introduced myself, she smiled with immediate recognition and said she had expected me on the holiday weekend again. I assumed she meant residents in general. I gave the usual orienting response, stated my name, and told her I was covering overnight. She said she knew. Then she asked whether I still took coffee black while pretending the tremor in my left hand was just fatigue. I had not mentioned the tremor to anyone on that unit. It was a minor thing, mostly noticeable after too much caffeine. I laughed in the automatic, distancing way physicians laugh when patients appear to make lucky interpersonal guesses. She did not laugh back. She only asked whether I had found a better apartment than the one near the train line, because she remembered I had slept badly there. I had moved out of an apartment near the train line 6 months earlier. There are several rational explanations for a patient seeming to know personal details. Staff gossip travels. Security overhears phone calls. Residents disclose more than they realize in workrooms and elevators. I told myself some version of that as I completed a brief overnight evaluation. Eleanor answered questions cleanly. No acute self-harm intent. No violent ideation. No gross disorganization. She denied hallucinations and described her chief problem as being repeatedly assigned doctors who forgot they had already met her. I documented chronic delusional beliefs with preserved behavioral control and moved on. The first crack came in the chart room. I opened her electronic record expecting the usual mess old academic cases produce. Instead, I found decades of carefully scanned notes, teaching summaries, consult addenda, and resident assessments. That alone was not strange. The strange part was the language. Across years and across different authors, phrases kept surfacing that belonged to my private writing habits. Not standard clinical language, my language. I had a bad tendency to describe patients as effortfully composed when I meant they were holding themselves together by force. I used the phrase conversationally intact to distinguish formal coherence from genuine organization. I once wrote that a patient remained attentive to exit geometry because I wanted to avoid repeating the word guarded for the 10th time in one night. Eleanor's chart contained all three phrases in notes written years apart by residents I had never met. Template contamination was my first explanation. Teaching hospitals breed stylistic inheritance. Junior residents absorb attending diction, then mistake it for their own. But that explanation weakened when I pulled paper archives from the file box in Eleanor's room. The oldest notes were handwritten or typed long before electronic templates standardized everything. Yet there it was again in margin comments, assessment summaries and progress notes, the same clipped turns of phrase, the same sentence rhythm, the same peculiar preference for semicolons that I had spent years trying and failing to outgrow. At 1 in the morning, I brought one of the older paper notes to the overnight charge nurse, Lydia Boone. She had worked the psych service longer than I had been in medicine. I asked whether residents on this unit tended to echo each other heavily in documentation. She skimmed the note and said residents often believed they invented wording that had already been circulating in training culture for years. Then she looked at the signature line and frowned. She asked why I was holding one of Dr. Avery's old notes. I said I was Dr. Avery. She gave me a patient, careful smile and said yes, of course. But she meant the earlier Dr. Avery. I told her there was no earlier Dr. Avery in my family and certainly none in this hospital. She blinked, genuinely unsettled, then said maybe she was confusing names. I wanted to push harder, but a consult page interrupted us. The rest of the night was filled with the normal debris of holiday call, an intoxicated emergency department evaluation, a restraint renewal on the medicine floor, a family demanding discharge reconsideration for a relative who had only arrived that afternoon. Normal work is often what makes the impossible intolerable, because it keeps insisting on administrative reality around the edges. By the time I returned to the psych unit near 3 in the morning, I had almost persuaded myself the chart language issue was a coincidence, amplified by fatigue. Then the unit clerk asked whether I wanted my usual call room key. I told her I did not have a usual call room. She looked confused and said, I always took the same one on the holidays because it was farther from the ice machine. The oddity might have died there if people had not continued placing me in a longer timeline than I occupied. A security officer asked whether I was still moonlighting in consultation liaison, which I had never done. A medicine resident thanked me for a recommendation I apparently made the previous winter before we had met. At 4 in the morning, the operator patched a page through to me and addressed me as Senior Night Psychiatry, a role filled by another resident entirely. None of these errors were impossible on their own. Together across one overnight shift, they created the same professional dread I had felt only once before during an intern year medication near miss. The sense that a system larger than you had begun making decisions in your name. I went back to Eleanor's room before dawn. She was awake, reading the oldest note in her chart box as though she had expected me to return for it. When I asked whether she had been discussing me with staff, she said discussion was the wrong word. She said they remembered me in the places the paperwork already had. I asked her what that meant. She told me room 412 had a history of keeping a doctor attached to it. Not in the supernatural sense people use when they are trying to sound theatrical. in the academic sense. One trainee became the reference point for the case. Then the language of that trainee bled into the chart. Then staff memory reorganized around the most recent version, because continuity is easier than admitting how long a person has remained unhelped in the same room, she said. Eventually, the unit stopped distinguishing between the patient who persisted and the doctor assigned to witness that persistence. I told her that was delusional. She nodded and said it always sounded that way at first. Morning rounds after Thanksgiving were lightly staffed and strangely casual. The attending on holiday backup had never met Eleanor in person. He relied on prior summaries and whatever the overnight resident handed him. When I presented her case, he interrupted midway and asked whether I could stop recycling the same language from previous years. He said the note sounded eerily identical to an older resident's formulation, and that I should work on finding my own voice. I had written the note at 3:30 that morning. After rounds, I went to graduate medical education and requested a copy of my onboarding file, because I wanted something official, fixed and external to compare against the drift on the unit. The coordinator was not in, but her office door was ajar, and the file cabinets beside the desk stood unlocked for holiday skeleton staffing. I knew I should not have looked. I looked anyway. My personnel folder existed. Inside were the expected items: contract, immunizations, training records, badge forms. But mixed among them were older photocopies, parking applications on outdated university letterhead, pager logs from years before medical school, holiday call schedules listing my name under psychiatry overnight service during years I had been in high school, then college, then nowhere near this hospital at all. Some forms carried slightly different signatures, as if I had been signing my own name after each reinvention with minor stylistic drift. I took photographs until I heard footsteps in the hall. When I looked up, Lydia Boone was in the doorway. She did not appear surprised to find me there. She only asked, very gently, whether I was trying to determine when I had started. I asked her what she thought. Her answer was careful. She said every few years a resident became unusually identified with room 412 because the patient was chronic, articulate, and academically attractive to people who believed understanding would count as progress. Most of those residents moved on. A few left stronger traces. One, she said, had language so distinctive that people began hearing it in other notes. Another had covered 3 holidays in a row and somehow felt permanently assigned even after graduation. Lydia said she used to think it was just institutional memory being lazy. Then she paused and admitted that each time the pattern recurred, the older name seemed harder to retrieve, as if the role remained and the person changed underneath it. I asked whether she thought that was happening to me. She did not answer directly. Instead, she told me to go home, after sign out and sleep before making any decisions about charts, archives, or room 412. I should have listened. Instead, I stayed for another overnight because the schedule demanded it and because leaving without resolution felt professionally cowardly. By then, my anxiety had become procedural. I checked badge logs, I checked parking entries, I checked call schedules, payroll timestamps, and archived teaching conference rosters. Every system confirmed me in the present and leaked me into the past. My badge number had been used in limited access areas years before issue. A conference attendance sheet from 7 years earlier listed my name beside a lecture on chronic institutionalization. A grainy group photograph from an old resident graduation banquet showed a face in the back row that was either mine or only mine after you had stared too long. On the second overnight, Eleanor asked me to bring the oldest paper chart from storage. I told myself I was doing it to disprove her. The storage room smelled of cardboard and dust. The oldest box was heavier than expected. Inside were admission packets, seclusion reviews, handwritten observations, and resident evaluations spanning decades. Near the bottom sat the document from the hook, the note signed in my hand before my life had even begun to accommodate such a hand. Behind it was something worse. A holiday coverage sheet from the late 1990s listing room 412 as primary teaching case. Beside the room number, under resident coverage, was my name. Under attending comments in red pen, someone had written, "Do not leave him with the chart too long." I carried the paper to Eleanor. She read my face before I sat down. Then she gave me the note and told me to look carefully at the language. She was right. It was mine not because I had copied it, but because it had already become the way I thought about patients. Or perhaps the way I thought had already been shaped around what waited in that room. The distinction no longer felt stable. I asked Eleanor if she knew who I was. She said yes. Then she added that the harder question was which interval of me the hospital was using. That night, the rest of the unit began sliding with her. A new intern on cross-cover called me for advice and then apologized for forgetting I had already graduated. The operator transferred a page meant for attending backup directly to my extension. When I checked the on-call board, my name appeared under both resident coverage and attending supervision in the same handwriting. No one else seemed alarmed. They seemed merely inconvenienced by my confusion. Near dawn, I opened my current badge photo on the hospital directory and compared it with the faded image attached to the ancient room 412 paperwork. Same face, yes, but more unsettling than that was the expression. In both photographs, I wore the same guarded, slightly tilted look, the expression of someone listening for the next question before the first had ended. The kind of expression Eleanor wore every time I walked into her room. I did eventually leave the hospital that weekend. At least I remember leaving. Payroll confirms I clocked out. My apartment keys were in my pocket. My dishes at home remained where I had left them. Yet for weeks afterward, colleagues greeted me with odd continuity, asking whether I was still carrying 412 or finally free of that room. One attending congratulated me on surviving another holiday with Eleanor, though by the official calendar it had been my first. I finished residency elsewhere. That also sounds like an ending. It is not. Every few months I receive an automated records notification from the university system, informing me that a chart I am associated with has been updated. The patient field is always blank. The room field always reads 412. Last month, out of weakness or habit, I opened one. The newest note was brief. Patient remains courteous but vertically vigilant. Interview deferred because physician appeared uncertain whether he was conducting the evaluation or inheriting it. There was no signature line, only a cursor blinking as if the system expected me to finish the thought. I still do not know whether room 412 held a patient who learned how to organize memory around herself, or whether the institution, unable to resolve a life spent observing the same suffering, simply began drafting new doctors into the old role until none of us could tell where. The witness ended and the case began. What I do know is that some rooms are never emptied in the way hospitals claim. They keep their beds, their notes, their vocabulary, and eventually the shape of the person expected to stand beside them. I sometimes wake before dawn with the distinct certainty that I am late for rounds in a building I no longer work in, and that a patient I have been meeting for years is waiting for me to remember which of us is supposed to be writing the chart.